Thank you for joining me on this interview today. Just to introduce myself, my name is Annie, and I created Sustainability Beyond the Lab to highlight sustainable innovations and make them more accessible for a general audience, as well as the barriers that prevent commercialization or widespread adoption. Just to begin, could you also introduce yourself and tell us about your role as Executive Director of Save the Bay?
Sure, I'm David Lewis. I'm the executive director of Save the Bay. Save the Bay is the oldest and largest environmental advocacy organization working to protect and restore San Francisco Bay for people and wildlife. We've been around since 1961 and have a pretty impressive record of impact, both on policy and actual implementation, helping make the Bay cleaner, restore wetlands, and engage lots of people as volunteers in that work to make the Bay better. As the executive director, I'm basically the chief of staff. We have a staff of 26 right now. And in addition to doing advocacy mostly at the local and regional level, but some state and federal advocacy for the Bay, we also have a volunteer program. We are restoring wetlands habitat around the Bay using adult volunteers. And we also have a student education program that gets students to the shoreline to learn about the Bay and help with stewardship to make the Bay better as well.
Save the Bay has been protecting and working to restore the bay for decades. What do you see as some of the biggest accomplishments, and what challenges is this organization still trying to um, overcome?
Sure. Well, when the organization was created in the 1960s, it really was a totally grassroots movement of citizens who were concerned because the bay was being filled in at a very rapid rate. A lot of the bay is shallow, and the marshes around the edges were not really appreciated for their importance ecologically. And so, over about 100 years since the gold rush, a lot of those shallow areas were filled in. First for agriculture to grow hay. Hay was the important crop for feeding horses, which were the engines of industry and transportation. And then in other parts of the bay, areas were separated from the bay to evaporate salt from the salt water. And
Mhm.
salt was an important crop because before refrigeration, that's how people preserved food. So that was how the edges of the bay were being filled in. And then as hay and salt became less important, those areas were developed and built on. And there were plans to fill in a lot more. So by 1961, the bay was actually one-third smaller than it had been just because of all of that filling. And
Mhm.
about 90% of the marshes had been destroyed, either diked off or paved over. And there were plans to fill in 60% of what was left. So that would have left just a narrow river for navigation in the bay and really would have destroyed the bay. Had a lot of impacts, not just on the ecology, but even on our weather. We have moderate weather here while the rest of the nation is baking, in part because we have this huge body of water. And it's also really important natural open space. It's scenery, so it's a big part of what attracts people to come visit here and want to live here and locate their businesses here. So that was the situation in the 1960s, and there were essentially no environmental laws to protect against that kind of destruction of the bay. There was no sewage treatment, so the bay was being polluted with sewage and a lot of industrial pollution.
Mhm.
So the organization got started at a time when it was really difficult to stop those bad things from happening. But because it was such a large movement that they prompted, they actually within 4 years, by 1965, had gotten the state to impose a moratorium on filling in the bay so that each city could not just fill in the wetlands on their shoreline. And that became a permanent regulatory agency called the San Francisco Bay Conservation and Development Commission, the first coastal zone management agency in the world. And all of the coastal zone management agencies in all of the countries in the rest of the United States are modeled after this first one, which was Save the Bay's first big achievement.
Mhm.
Um, Since then, we've stopped a lot of bad developments on the shoreline. There were proposals to expand San Francisco Airport another 2 miles further into the bay for moving their runways. There were proposals to build 14,000 homes on some salt ponds in Redwood City. We were able to stop that. And then in 2016, we were the lead advocates, the culmination of over a decade of work to create a new regional funding source for wetland restoration. A parcel tax was Measure AA, and it passed in all 9 Bay Area counties. So every parcel in the Bay Area is paying $12 a year, one of the smaller taxes in existence, and that's generating $25 million every year for grants, not to our organization, but through an agency to restore more wetlands.
Hmm.
And people can see those wetlands being restored all around the bay, especially in the South Bay and areas that used to be salt ponds, the North Bay along Highway 37. And those marshes are super important for fish and wildlife and birds. They're really the base of the food chain for all of the ocean food.
Yeah.
So those are just a few of the things that Save the Bay has worked on. And the biggest challenges right now, definitely climate change and pollution,
Hmm.
and they're closely related. The climate change impact that's going to affect the bay the most is sea level rise. It puts a lot of shoreline development and shoreline habitat at risk from rising tides. There's a lot that we can do to prepare for that and to reduce the impacts, but it requires a lot of preparation and money
Hmm.
for cities in particular to look ahead and plan how they're going to adapt to sea level rise.
Hmm.
And then different kinds of pollution are going to be bigger problems in the bay too. We're going to get more frequent rainstorms, heavy rainstorms that wash more pollution into the bay. Most of the bay pollution comes from our streets because the stormwater and the water that goes down the drain in the streets is not, for the most part, screened or treated before it gets out into the bay. So when we have more rain, more pollution on the streets gets into the bay, trash and other chemicals. And then the other thing that climate change is doing is warming the oceans and warming the bay, and that results in different threats that we're experiencing already, like algal blooms
Hmm.
and red tide, and different kinds of invasive species that are more prevalent when the water temperature is higher. So we have a lot still to work on, and that's why it's really important that Say the Bay is able to, attract a lot of volunteers and supporters to help us do that advocacy work.
Yeah. Thank you for that explanation of Save the Bay and what challenges you're trying to work on, as well as what's already been done. Um, your work kind of sits at the intersection of like public policy, science, funding, as well as conservation. How do you balance these different priorities while leading the organization?
Yeah, that's a great question. Well, fortunately, there's a lot of great science and research happening in the Bay Area by government agencies, by private entities.
Hmm.
And so we find that there's actually a lot of really sound science and knowledge, especially about climate change and climate impacts, and about species. So we don't really need to recreate that. Unfortunately, that science and good information and recommendations for how to improve things, it doesn't always have the impact that it should. So
Hmm.
we try to be the advocacy organization that takes that good information and science that others are creating and tries to make sure that it has more impact by really getting to the people who have the power to make change, which is mostly local policymakers, elected officials, staff of agencies, staff of cities. They need to have that information, but they also need to have public pressure
Hmm.
and encouragement from organizations like ours to translate that into policies. Why does that take an effort? Well, change is always difficult for people, and it's especially difficult when it costs money or it affects vested interests, people who have built in areas where they were allowed to build that are starting to become less safe because of the risk of flooding. just as one example, or sewage treatment plants that were built to handle the pollution that we knew about 50 years ago, but haven't been upgraded.
Yeah.
So there are lots of reasons why, good information, good science, good policy suggestions don't automatically get incorporated and translated into new regulations, new laws, new practices, new zoning, new city plans, new transportation infrastructure. But the main reason is that there's a lot of interest and money and power in keeping things the way they are.
Yeah.
Business loves a predictable environment. And so business doesn't like change. And people who've moved someplace because of the way it was 50 years ago,
Hmm.
it's hard to convince them that things need to be different now or in the future. And we see that with housing and transportation and lots of issues. So, Say the Bay tries to really focus on advocacy and policy changes that make use of good information and also help decision makers who are in this challenging position to do the right thing for the most people, especially for the people that are most at risk,
Hmm.
and do the right thing that's going to be the right thing for decades to come, not just continue something that was the right thing 50 years ago.
Yeah. What barriers would you say are the greatest in like preventing environmental progress? Um, those would include like political, based on scientific innovations, public opinion, or maybe a combination of all of these factors.
Yeah, I think the biggest factor is vested political power, which is usually closely related to economic power.
Mm.
So, money has a lot of influence,
Yeah.
whether it's, then that doesn't just mean, rich people who can make big campaign contributions to
Mhm.
elected officials. That's sort of the most obvious case. But businesses that have invested money in building buildings or building homes in certain places, and there's a lot of value in those homes or buildings or other infrastructure, and there's a lot of cost to change that or move that.
Mhm.
So it's really, I think the barriers to change are almost always economic and political inertia, or habit. And sometimes that is hard to overcome when it's a lot of money or, a lot of political investment. Um, I think, frankly, a lot of elected official jobs are not great jobs right
Mhm.
now. Elected officials get a lot of grief. They're actually not very well paid. And so that does not attract the best and brightest people always.
Mm.
It's, there are some great people who are willing to do that kind of public service uh, without much thanks, but there are also a lot of people who would be great at those jobs who don't pursue them for those reasons. So that's an additional hurdle, I think, to getting the right thing done. But we have to work with the people who are in those positions of power and authority and with the systems and the laws that have been set up or change them to make them better and make room for innovation and technology that makes sense and is wise to actually, be adopted and incorporated.
Yeah. Looking ahead maybe 10 to 20 years in the future, what advances in scientific innovations, policy, or other environmental challenges are you the most excited for or have or think have the most potential to help protect the bay?
Well, that is a really good question. Um, I think what I'm most excited about is the innovation that we've already seen, which I hope continues
Hmm.
in efficiency, especially energy efficiency for non-polluting sources of energy, because our demand for energy has continued to grow
Hmm.
But because of better, more efficient buildings, more efficient transportation, more efficient appliances, the total amount of energy we're consuming, until recently anyway, had not gone up, even though we're demanding more.
Hmm.
And that's really important because if the energy can be created with zero pollution or less pollution to the climate, then we've already locked in a lot of climate change. But if we can limit the additional climate change that we're locking in, then some of these other things that we're doing, like trying to protect the shoreline against sea level rise, we buy some time,
Hmm.
right? Because right now, on the flip side, the thing that is most worrisome is all the predicted impacts from climate change are happening faster and larger than was predicted. So that means we're losing time to
Hmm.
prepare. Um, but there's still a lot more that we could do to use less energy and to produce it more cleanly. Including we create a lot of waste as humans, and much of that waste, especially the organic waste, could be converted to energy.
Yeah.
And now there are technologies that can do that very cleanly. Um, So that is something that I hope there will be more of in the future.
Hmm. Before we finish, is there anything that we didn't get to discuss during the interview that you think is important for the general public to know?
Yeah, I mean, I think another feature of the Bay Area is that we are really balkanized politically. We have 9 different counties that all have part of the Bay,
Hmm.
100 cities. We have state agencies, federal agencies, regional agencies. We have a lot of overlapping jurisdictions. And that actually gets in the way of making regional decisions. When San Francisco and San Jose were 2 large cities with not very much in between that were 50 miles apart, then it was okay to make different decisions in San Francisco and San Jose. They wouldn't affect each other.
Hmm.
But now, even though we have all those cities, they are all basically one metropolis. They all share the basin that is the bay. And it makes it even more important to make decisions regionally and not let individual local jurisdictions do whatever they want,
Yeah.
uh, because what they do and don't do has impact on their neighbors. So the Bay is actually one of the few issues in the Bay Area where we've actually been able to make decisions about the regionally and not with each city. And that's really going back to the agency that I mentioned at the beginning, the Bay Conservation and Development Commission, a regional agency that regulates and permits what happens in the water and on the shoreline for the whole Bay Area. It's not up to Palo Alto. It's not up to Hayward. It's not up to Richmond alone to decide what happens. But that's only the water and a 100-foot shoreline band around the Bay Area.
Hmm.
So if there's one thing that we need more of, it's regional government and regional decisions so that local governments and local populations can't just keep saying, not in my backyard, or only we get to decide what happens in our backyard. It's not gonna, it hasn't worked well to do it that way, and it's gonna be a bigger problem with climate change because climate change doesn't really know those artificial political
Right.
boundaries, 5 square miles of a city.
Hmm.
So um, so that's a particular problem in the Bay Area because of the way we've drawn these city lines and county lines and split things up.
Yeah. Thank you so much for sharing both your perspective on like sustainability as well as your work at Save the Bay.